Don, thank you for coming here. As you know, BRE Trust, in collaboration with G4C, is funding this research project, and the topic is open data. So how can open data help the construction industry to overcome the issues that we are facing, ahead of the 2025 milestone? The first thing I would like to do with you is to help people understanding what really open data is about. As usual, when innovation comes from IT, it's quite difficult to understand. And I think there is a very first necessary exercise we should be going through, which is simplifying the language, understanding a essential lexicon that we can share with the rest of the industry. Yeah. So my first question really is, what's open data?
Sure, that's absolutely fine. The key difference with open data versus any other type of information is that it's released. Open data is any data which an organisation chooses to share and make available to other people with no use restrictions, no licensing concerns, just raw information. The important thing that you have with open data is that it's also reusable. Alongside, there's no point just releasing all of the information you have in a series of Word documents or pieces of paper which you pin up to the door of your office. What you need to do is to make things available online. You need to make them available in a way which people can reuse. So not something which is closed off. Say, if you put a PDF of a list of numbers up on your website showing how many sites you work on around the country, nobody else can reuse that PDF document because it's not an open format. If you put that same information up in a Microsoft Excel document, that means somebody can go, take that Excel document, combine it with other Excel documents and start to learn something.
There's a lot of talk about big data versus open data. What's the difference? When do you use one or the other?
Yeah, that's fine. As you're saying, it's an innovation. Open data is quite a new area, and as such, in the early days of many things, there's a lot of crossover between the terms. So there are plenty of bits of open data that could be classed as big and vice versa. Big data, as its name suggests, tends to revolve around a large quantity of information, a significantly huge amount. So for instance, a good example from a local authority perspective would be a typical piece of open data would be, say, here's the location of every adventure playground within our borough. The equivalent piece of big data might say, here's the number of children who visit it, here's the times they visited it, here's the items they used in that adventure playground. What you get there is a very big data set which you can really learn a lot from, which says it informs about risk. For instance, if you have every child is only going on the big slide and nobody's going on the little slide, well, maybe you should consider putting some barriers around the big slide because one of these days a child's going to slide straight off. Big data doesn't have to be open. If you're a construction company, you will deal with a lot of information that's big data. You don't have to release that, but you can do. There's not a one-to-one relationship between the two.
I will move later on a potential application for open data. There is another term that I would like you to help us with, which is Internet of Things.
Yeah, sure. So with the massive reduction in cost for effectively being able to track the location of things, the Internet of Things basically says, well, what benefits can be leveraged by using the internet to track and collate information about pretty much anything. A good example would be if you're an electronics manufacturer or a home goods manufacturer, you will start tagging every single item that you send for delivery. Every single item that goes onto any truck will have a little tracker on it. That means that you don't just know when one truck leaves A and arrives at B and then have to wait for stores C, D and E to confirm their receipt of the particular chunk of that truckload. You have information which shows where everything was as individual items. Then you can see how they actually go off and make sure that 47 washing machines made it to one location, 37 dishwashers made it to another. That's done automatically. Not only does it increase the amount of information you have, it's also far more efficient and cheaper. Because those items will be tracked automatically, you don't have to have somebody in a warehouse checking them off. For instance, you could do it for all the goods you receive into your yard. if you're working on a building site. You can do it with, people do it with fleet cars. So if you have a lot of cars in your organisation, plenty of organisations now track their cars. Not just to keep an eye on their staff, but as much to leverage benefits from saying, well, actually, why do we have 5 cars operating in Swindon that come in from a long distance? Actually, we could probably afford to get rid of at least one of those, because these cars all cross over each other again and again and again in a very small area. So the Internet of Things is effectively about just expanding how we track, what we monitor, into a whole host of things that would previously have been classed as either inanimate or at the very least just a dead piece of equipment like a toaster.
So we have data coming from objects, creating the Internet of Things, or we have data coming from people, either willingly or unwillingly being generated. And then we have developers, app developers, that can use data, and they have a certain expertise that allows them to create new products.
Yeah.
Products or tools or dashboards. I would like really to, I know it's a vast subject, but I would like to quickly ask you the basic terminology of app development. Maybe let's start from mapping and the relevance of GIS.
Yeah, sure. I think it's fair to say that most organisations of any kind, public, private or charity, all have a geographic focus or an area that they tend to work in. Sometimes the whole country, sometimes a very small area, sometimes in the case of a building company, a particular site. Now, depending on the scale of those organisations, you are going to want to be able to map things. Effectively, all that mapping says is that you have pieces of information which you might have had before. Let's say you had a list of your customers. What mapping says is, well, if you can put an X and a Y coordinate, something which allows you to be placed on a map of the world, and you do that for that entire group of customers, you will then be able to not only view that information on a map, which the visual spread of information is a far easier thing and a far quicker thing to interpret than just looking at a list of information. It's a far quicker way to deliver a message. But what mapping really allows for is the combination with other things. That's its real power. But effectively, mapping is quite simply that. It's applying an X and a Y coordinate to anything to allow it to be placed on an actual map.
Okay, so we have the first 2 main characters of the saga. We have the map and we have the data.
Yeah.
And data can be a bit of a hard animal to tame. We need to crunch them, we need to mash them.
Yes.
Could you help us just understand at least these 2 terms?
Yeah, no problem. Crunching and mashing, again, don't let people in IT name things, is a long-standing rule within IT, because they always come up with dreadful terms. Effectively, they mean the same thing. Really, what this is talking about is combining data set, pieces of information together from different sources to learn something you didn't know before. So, for instance, you might have one piece of information that says there's very high crime in an area, but you don't know why. You can go onto the police website, see that there's a crime hotspot, but you don't really know why. You then need to look at another data set to see, well, actually, there are, say, a series of huge car parks there. And actually, when you look at the crime data more closely, you see that actually it's vehicle crime. It's not a fair spread, an equal spread between crime against the person, crime against property. It's actually all about cars. But you wouldn't have known that that was necessarily to do with the car parks without combining the 2 pieces of information together. Effectively, it's about leveraging benefits. It's the kind of thing we all do in our day-to-day life all the time. But the industry has felt the need to come up with a term which makes it sound like something different. It's not. It's simply combining different things together to learn something more.
And as usual, the best way to use artificial intelligence is to try to mimic what human intelligence does, and just multiply the speed factor and the efficiency. And talking about efficiency, then we could now we've presented the map and the data, bring them together and start talking about planning.
Yeah, sure.
So the purpose of our conversation really is to explore how open data may help improve the UK planning system, which is an incredibly difficult matter. Somehow suffering from a long-lasting legacy of a system being invented for different times, in a different industry, with a substantial amount of pressure and responsibility left to the individual officer, which has to do a great amount of work to individually assess projects. That conversation is a vital one. From the result of the conversation between the private developer and the public officer, reality in the built environment is generated. So we want to make sure that on the one hand we allow adequate resources from the planners team. On the other hand, we try to help them, creating efficiency and simplifying the process as far as we can. Substantial innovation has been delivered by the planning portal, a few years old now, and the various national planning policy frameworks that over the years are trying to streamline things. Yet, one of the reasons our industry is still losing out on other industry in terms of potential for growth is that the planning is still seen by investors as a great risk. It's a great risk and one from which is kind of hard to learn from. Certain risk mitigation processes may apply in one borough. You walk a few miles down the road is a completely different story. So, how do we help planning, helping the industry, helping economy?
Absolutely. I think there's huge scope in most areas, but I think planning is a prime example. And also, it comes from both sides of the divide. It isn't solely about, it's a question of, I think, all parts in the planning process, improving the way that they work. I've worked with construction companies, I've worked with planning departments, I've worked with a range, and it's very opaque, the way that they operate. And if you don't actually work within the organisation and actually know how the process is actually, kind of go from A to B, decisions aren't taken, planning officers don't make things up, they don't pull answers out of a hat, they don't sit there and, flip over cards and say that's the answer. There is always a process that's gone through, and it's making that process understandable to people. By understanding the process, you have a better opportunity, even if not of making a particular application successful, being able to learn something which you can take forward to the next one. Obviously, there are always politics involved in planning. By definition, it's a very, very political area of local authority work. That element, you're probably never really going to be able to remove. The local character of a particular area, the people who represent that area, the particular makeup of local groups and their particular attitudes, those things will always be different in every area, and there is nothing you can do about that. However, the other parts of the process consequently should be even more standardised to try and make up for those variables which can never be changed. Standardisation of planning information nationally in terms of how the application information is published would be a really good first step. You're absolutely right, the planning portals from a few years ago looked very cutting edge at the time, and they were very much at the top end of what the internet was offering. Now they already look, because of the pace of change, they already look like they're slightly behind the times. They're also very inefficient. There are over 600 local authorities in the country. Every single one of those has come up with their own solution. Some of that will be very inefficient, expensive, individual solutions with private sector IT. Others will be internal solutions which have taken hundreds of hours to develop. What really should be happening, as is happening with other parts of council work increasingly, information is being sucked up from local databases, combined nationally, packaged into something which is usable, and then distributed, in some cases sold, unfortunately still. It's not true, not all of that's truly open, but increasingly their addresses being a very good example. The databases which all planning officers use rely on a system called an LLPG, a local land and property gazetteer. All local authorities are required to have one. That information, that address information, is sucked up and is nationally distributed and sold as a product called Address Base by Ordnance Survey. Now, planning departments rely on those LLPGs. So there is already a framework in place, a degree of standardisation in local authority systems, which it would be a big piece of work, but would be massively beneficial to make a single point where you could access planning information from across the country and not have to worry so much about what are civil administrative boundaries designed to create roughly proportionate electorates often. It's not, the local authority boundaries are not the boundaries which most people recognise as boundaries in their lives, but they are. And so I think standardisation across the information which local authorities collect on planning applications is key. Also making the information which supports their decisions. Officers in a given area don't base their decision on things that are in their head. They have the planning application in front of them. They also combine it with the policy framework. A lot of that stuff is spatial. A lot of that stuff can be released as open data. For instance, if you construct in London, you have to be aware of the viewing corridors that exist across London. There are certain viewing corridors which maintain, so you have a clear line of sight between some of the high points in London, Parliament Hill, Hampstead Heath, St Paul's, Westminster. And in those corridors, you're not allowed to build anything over a certain number of stories because it obscures the view. Up until a few years ago, that information wasn't available to anybody. If you were very diligent, you went to an office, you developed, you could probably get the information from your council that way. But it's a very arduous way to obtain information and then try and work out where that is. Increasingly now, local authorities make that information available online, viewable on a map, and allows people to inform that decision. So let's say you're a developer, you want to put in a planning application, being able to know that where you're looking to build, you're not allowed to build anything more than 7 stories tall. That's a benefit. But a lot of that, I think, is existing information, and that's just about making better use of it, making it more available and standardising it. I think there's a whole other area of open data that construction and indeed councils can take advantage of, which is in data which is actually already collected by other national organisations. Census, health, crime. Those people-focused data sets give a vast amount of data as to what's going on in a particular area, which no other organisation can make available to you and can't be collected. If community engagement's important, if consultation is part of the process that you're going through, which I'm pretty sure is the case for all large construction companies, being able to understand the area you are trying to build in or want to build in is of huge benefit. Knowing the socio-economic breakdown, knowing the health status, knowing the history and the changes in crime and the recording of crime in that particular area. All of these things help create an evidence base. Now,
and I think on that basis, we could then extend the need for innovation, not just within the public sector. It's not only the planners, the ones who need to innovate, but also the private sector. Because innovation has to benefit both of them. On the one hand, yes, we want the investors to be more reassured or having a better risk mitigation. So we want to streamline the process. On the other hand, we need the planners to deal with better informed private developers. So, if crime, health and welfare could be combined in an openly accessible database against which developers would be able to suggest proposals, we may improve collaboration between the two parties.
Absolutely. I mean, most local authorities increasingly use most big organisations use business intelligence now, which is effectively about combining big data that you hold internally, sometimes sensitive, sometimes not, with big data that's available from other organisations to effectively, it's modelling really, for want of a better term, being able to have a collection of data which you can ask questions of. If I do this, what will happen to that? If I change X, what is the impact on Y? If I don't change X, what is the impact on Y? Being able to ask those quite simple questions of well combined, well put together data is a huge benefit. And I'd be surprised, most industries don't, I'd be very surprised if many construction companies have the kind of skill set within them to take advantage of that, which means those companies are missing out. I mean, my experience of dealing with developers and construction companies are the area of that company which will be best informed about what's going on in a particular area will be the marketing company. And that's a very skewed view. While it's obviously, terribly important to ensure that you can market what you're selling, to have that as the repository of local knowledge in a particular area isn't the way to make informed decisions. That doesn't add value to how you're running your project. That solely ensures one particular outcome.
Let's focus on the opportunity for the private sector for a second.
Yeah.
So imagine a good council, take Lambeth, releasing open data, releasing data in regards to health and what we just discussed, crime and density, occupational level, and then take a private developer who's just running a business as usual business case.
Yeah.
So trying to maximize footprint with some sort of predictive analytics related to sales only, nothing else.
Yeah.
Compared to another developer who's got an in-house, a data scientist team, who can understand the need for the public sector to invest on the social and environmental value of the transformation. What's the opportunity there for the private sector?
Again, I think it's not always the case that by spending resource to gather information or to standardise the way you hold it, whether public or private, it isn't always the case that automatically means you'll be making lots of open data. But at the very least, it will always inform and improve your chances for future pieces of work. For instance, if a construction company, noise is a classic problem associated with sites, construction sites. A lot of the most vociferous complaints from residents during the planning process, which may well lead to an otherwise perfectly decent planning application being turned down. A lot of the criticism will be around noise and dust, is the perennial issues. If the evidence base that you can provide as a construction company from previous sites that you've worked on, which show that actually through tracking your plant, through actually having mappable records of monitoring sites, you put up half a dozen air quality monitoring posts around the site that track how much dust there is in the air. Now you're able to take that, not only does it inform you for your own business, it also means you can present that as evidence to your next planning application and actually say, look, fair enough, we understand your concern as a local group that you don't want excessive noise levels. Here's the evidence, not just us saying we are ISO accredited, of course we won't do that, to actually say, here's the evidence from our last 4 major jobs, none of which have ever breached this particular level. That is going to help that put upon pressured planning officer to be able to make a more independent decision. If as a planning officer, you're dealing with the opinion of one group of people versus the opinion of another, you have to be you have to be doubly sure that you're making what appears to be an impartial decision. The more evidence you can put on both sides, the more that decision becomes one automatic, far simpler to make, and I would say more often than not, the better decision would come out. The more evidence you have, the better your chance of a successful planning application. So get better evidence about how you operate.
The need for evidence takes us to the third main character of the saga. We presented the public, the private, and then we have society at large. So planning has a very delicate role of explaining to society, the rest of the community, what the transformation is going to deliver and how the city is going to change. And as much as we all try very hard in explaining things, there is always a very kind of territorial instinct, not in my backyard.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the other hand, when consultation is run properly, when community is truly engaged, change happens. And often projects are enriched by the input the community can give. Is open data able to help us on that?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think organisations, when an organisation looks at or starts to think, hey, should we be doing something with open data? Should we be publishing some of our information? Or even, how can we improve our businesses internally by taking advantage of open data or big data? Most organisations understandably look at saving money that is already spent. Say, okay, I spend X per year on this. Can this save us money? Yes. Whether that's through increasing the number of successful applications we get through or simply reducing the cost of a particular type of operation. And that's a really good benefit. It also helps make your organisation more transparent, which tends to give you a better reception. If people can understand more what you do and you make that more open, people will are less likely to be suspicious of what you're doing or fearful because they can understand what you're doing. But you're right, the big thing, or the missing piece of the puzzle, is that the public and people who aren't within your organisation or even your industry will see things that which you will not. People who aren't hidebound by the industries and the areas we work in will look at something you release and see a completely different benefit. And you will, as an organisation, you would never be able to think of that benefit. But members of the public will. They will see, for instance, we, as a local authority, did some work to release simple information around where all of our licensed premises are. So if you're a licensed premise, so if you have dancing, if you have music, if you have alcohol for sale, if you any of these things, you all need different types of licensing. We released that information, and a member of the public saw an opportunity to create a restaurant app, effectively, for the local area. Now, the area had a massive numbers of restaurants opening very, very quickly as the area became quite gentrified. But nobody really knew. I mean, I lived in the area and I didn't really access a lot of these restaurants. Didn't know they were tucked away down little kind of side alleys, tucked away in markets that were being converted. Effectively, somebody saw from this whole bunch of licensing data of all licensed premises, said, oh, actually, look, here's a way that we can provide information to other people, like other like-minded foodies like me, where just the restaurants are. So effectively, that person took a cut of that data, which related to just the restaurants, made a little app of it, published it, and effectively allowed local residents to quickly locate nearest restaurants, new restaurants. Now, while that's great for restaurant goers, it's particularly good for local businesses. You can't really, it's very hard to quantify how much, extra footfall you get through a small restaurant from that kind of application, that kind of information. But the margins are very tight. Anything like that can be helpful. And I think the bigger the organisation, the benefits scale as well. Very small organisations, you release open data, you may get small benefits. If you're a national construction company, if you focus and really commit to doing things with open data and big data, the benefits, I think, are shown to be huge, absolutely huge.
Coming to the conclusion of our conversation today, it would seem to me, not understanding the nuts and bolts of programming, that if you communicate in a better way, if you explain how things work, and if you show evidence of existing trends and potential future trends, then you allow opportunities to rise. And with those opportunities, there is also the possibility from one party to understand his peers, for the public sector to understand the relevance of risk mitigation for the private perspective, and vice versa, for the private developers to understand the relevance of sustainable and social added value. So, I would like to imagine that we are just at the beginning of a quiet revolution where better communication would provide growth and new opportunities.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think the pace of change in most areas of our society is so rapid, but in open data and generally information, it's just huge. The pace is so quick. And I think absolutely right. I think you can look at even down to a personal level. I think from a personal through to a national level, there are huge benefits, and even an international one. I mean, there's a new directive which a lot of people don't necessarily agree with the European Union. Leaving that issue aside, all the national governments of Europe recently agreed, or over the last few years, of putting in place an agreement to effectively mean that every country and every local authority within it, every region, publishes information about its environment to the same standard, in the same place, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the Black Sea, and it's going to be a massive resource. Now, this is the first, there's been several stuttering attempts to do this kind of thing. The standardisation we were discussing around just, say, a national policy framework, there's already a movement in place. It's called Inspire, which is quite a convenient term. And Inspire is basically saying, release all this information, make it available to people. There is a technical barrier. That, for me, is the thing which will hopefully change over the next few years. Increasingly, there's momentum around releasing information. There's a momentum around creating an Internet of Things for whatever your organisation does. I think the big change that's going to happen over the next few years is going to be a change in how technical you have to be to understand it and to use it. Because I think to date that's been very much the barrier. There are a lot of good ideas, there's a lot of willing people inside organisations, members of the public. But at the moment you have to have a technical skill set to be able to really, you know, if you see an opportunity in data to turn it into something, you either have to know how to do it yourself, or you have to ask somebody else or pay them. Making that simpler is going to be the real, I think, the next kind of paradigm shift in how open data and how big data supports any industry, and certainly the construction industry.
That's great. I just ask you the last thing. Give us an example of an app based on open data that you came across in your work, and quite simply you thought, that's quite smart.
Oh, they are. I think the instances are increasingly legion. It was designed with quite a fun intention, I think, but actually turned out to having quite a powerful use, and actually quite a practical one. There was the police increasingly released their information via a website. They had huge problems with data quality first off, because police officers couldn't record information exactly where it happened in a particular space. They would often record it to the nearest point of reference, a particular pub, a particular road junction, and so you didn't get an accurate map of where crime actually happened originally. You got everything clustered together with lots of gaps between. Police have done a lot of work, and now the information that most police authorities release is very, very accurate as to where things happened. They make that data available, and if you go onto the police data website, there's a series of apps which other people have made using the police data. And some colleagues in the community safety team sent some information on and said, "Well, take a look at this app." And effectively what it does, it maps crime and plays, now this does sound quite fun, it plays an audio track as you approach the incident of a particular crime. That music changes according to the type of crime that took place there. Now, all jokes aside, it doesn't sound like a movie score. It's not somebody going, as things kind of become more and more scary. It also changed volume according to the number of crimes, incidents recorded in that particular spot. So effectively, if you're walking around, let's say, and again, the victims of crime tend to be young or very old. So, you're 15, 16, a prime target for a whole host of street crime. This app would effectively, when you're walking along, when do you not see a teenager with earphones in, it would actually play a little piece of music over whatever you were listening to, which basically indicated that you were approaching an area, a crime hotspot.
Fantastic.
Lovely idea.
That's a lovely idea. Tom, thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.